Y'all ready for some Star Trek hot takes? Because I got some Star Trek hot takes. Threshold is actually good. Okay, no one would actually ever say that. That's ridiculous. Sub Rosa, though. Hello, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well. And no, I am not having the hot take that Sub Rosa is good. That's too hot even for Jessie, and believe me, I know hot. But I do hope this video is a little bit controversial because what I'm going to be talking about this week is I'm going to be discussing a few episodes of all of the different Star Trek shows that many people out there really love, are frankly beloved by a lot of other Trekkies, but for me particularly, I don't find them to be some of the best of the best Star Trek episodes. As many of you know, I have been ranking over the past few weeks on this channel my top 10 favorite episodes of each and every Star Trek show. And while I was sort of making those lists, while I was mostly just sort of using my own thoughts and feelings about the series as a whole, when I was researching them, I did look out and kind of see what a lot of people out in the fandom sort of consider to be the best Star Trek episodes of every series. And I also kind of knew this just generally from being a Trekkie for pretty much my entire life. But while I was doing that research and sort of reminding myself of what many other people consider to be like the best of Star Trek, I found a few episodes that I was like, I'm actually kind of shocked that this episode is as highly regarded as many others. So I just want to go through and just talk about a few episodes that many other people consider to be like the best of each of their respective series, but for me personally, I don't love them as much as other people do. Now, being very clear, this is not me saying that I hate these episodes. There's only one episode on this list that I actually like objectively think is bad actually. And I'll talk about which one that is when we get there. It's actually the first one on the list. But for all the rest of these, I actually think these are actually really good and solid episodes. So just know before you start yelling at me in the comments, this is not me saying these episodes are bad. This is just me saying they're not as good as other people consider them to be, at least in my opinion. And again, just my opinion. But that being said, let's get on to the list, starting with number 1, The Enemy Within. Like I said, this Star Trek The Original Series episode is the only episode on this list that I actually do think is bad. A lot of people consider this episode, which is the first ever transporter malfunction episode where Kirk gets split into two, into a good side and a bad side, to actually be one of the best episodes of the original series for them. And on the surface, I can understand why. It has that sort of very cool science fiction concept of like, oh, the two sides of man, the duality of humanity, and we're exploring that through this sort of science fiction Captain Kirk idea.
Captain Kirk! I'm Captain Kirk!
I kind of like that in a very 1960s science fiction way. But especially when we're looking at it with a modern lens, this whole concept of like the good side and animalistic side inside each and every one of us doesn't really work as well for me because I honestly don't really feel like they map on to anything really human in a lot of us. Like, it's an interesting sort of concept, but I don't really think it speaks to anything personal. I guess it's more like, have confidence in yourself versus like not having confidence, because a lot of this episode is the good Kirk being like, I don't know if I should do something. I'm kind of nervous about it. I'm unsure. But then it also sort of subtly implies that there's this part of each of us that is just base, evil, awful, and willing to do horrific acts and just wanting to lash out and attack people.
I have to take him back. Inside myself. I can't survive without him. I don't want to take him back. He's like an animal. A thoughtless, brutal animal. Yet it's me.
But it does lead me to what I absolutely hate this episode for, and that is the fact that the animal Kirk goes and tries to sexually assault Yeoman Rand. And then, not only that, after that, the good Kirk gets to interrogate her, which, by the way, if you are someone who is sexually assaulted, you should in no way be not only put in the same room as someone who you consider to be the person that sexually assaulted you, but also that person shouldn't be the one to investigate you, because ultimately we get the scene that happens here where Yeoman Rand is gaslit by Kirk into believing that she wasn't even sexually assaulted at all, and him sort of saying like, it wasn't me, and telling, like, making her question her own sexual assault.
I was frightened, maybe.
Yeoman, I was in my room. It wasn't me.
Sir, Fisher saw you too.
Fisher's.
If it hadn't been... I can understand. I don't want to get you into trouble. I wouldn't have even mentioned it.
It wasn't me.
Well, I know this wasn't the intention of the episode. I know the episode wasn't trying to say, like, that women shouldn't be believed or anything like that. It does have that connotation to it. It does sort of that underlying sort of feeling to it that makes me very uncomfortable, especially when you learn what happened to Grace Lee Whitney behind the scenes of Star Trek. If you know that story and her story specifically, this sort of sequence runs even grosser. But what really puts the rotten cherry, I guess, on the cake is the final joke of the episode where Spock goes up to Rand after everything's said and done, and he sort of makes this joke about like, oh, I guess the animalistic Kirk had some good qualities about him.
The imposter had some interesting qualities, wouldn't you say? Human.
Sort of laughing about Yim and Rand's sexual assault, and it feels very out of character for Spock and just feels very gross and nasty and just leaves me very uncomfortable at the end of this episode. So for all of that, I think this is one of the few episodes of the original series that I not only dislike, where other people love it, but I personally despise it. So that is the one episode that I dislike. Everything else on this list I actually do like for the most part, but that brings me to number 2, The Inner Light. On literally every single list of Best Next Generation episodes that I saw, I found The Inner Light on it. And I can, again, understand why. The sort of emotional catharsis of this episode, of Picard learning that this ancient civilization was just trying to give a gift of having someone understand them for the last time, that they sent this probe out into the world so they could have someone live a life on their colony and like remember them in a way that they wish to be remembered, is honestly a truly emotionally gut-punching storyline. And honestly, when I watch the episode, I sort of start crying at that last scene, because it's also about living in the now, living in the present, and enjoying each moment despite all the horrors around you. And even if the future doesn't look bright, you can still find some hope somewhere. Like, all of that is incredibly wonderful and emotional, and I think it's really, really great. So I understand why people love this episode, especially, again, also the music. The Ruskin flute like song is also a beautiful written musical piece for this episode. All of that is great.
Seize the time, Maribor. Live now. Make now always the most precious time. Now will never come again.
But what keeps this episode from being fantastic in my mind is I feel like some of the way that this episode is structured leading into that emotional revelation doesn't work as well for me. For example, logically, I just dislike this idea of this probe that sort of essentially traumatizes a person, makes someone live an entire life without their consent or awareness or knowledge.
That's what this launching is. A probe that finds me in the future.
Yes, my love. The rest of us have been gone 1,000 years. If you remember what we were and how we lived, then we'll have found life again.
Oh, this planet just made an entire gaslighting machine? Is their last act into the world to like non-consensually force someone to live a life against their will? And so that just sort of rubs me the wrong way. But then on top of that too, there's this sort of mystery that this episode wants to have you sort of invest in, of like Picard being unsure of why he's on this planet. What's going on? Am I stuck here for the rest of my life? And I feel like that would have been made even more powerful if we didn't constantly get cutbacks to Picard being knocked out on the bridge of the Enterprise. And we sort of see everyone on the bridge being like, oh, what's happening to Picard? That storyline doesn't progress at all. It's just sort of everyone being like, what's happening to Picard for like 10 minutes of the episode, just to sort of pad out time. And it also takes away from the tension of Picard sort of coming to accept that he is stuck on this planet, because we know he's still on the Enterprise.
Start at 10%.
The beam is fully restored, Doctor.
Blood pressure up to 90/40.
So you're sort of removing the sort of tension of like Picard wanting to escape this planet, because you know he's going to eventually, because he's still on the Enterprise technically. And I really wish we could have removed that to really focus in on the story. So The Inner Light, I think, is a really good episode, and it does have a really great emotional impact to it. But I think if the script had been a little bit tighter, then I would consider it to be one of the best episodes of The Next Generation. But as it is, it's just a good one. Number 3, Dear Doctor. This is a Star Trek Enterprise episode that I was actually kind of shocked to see enter a lot of people's best of Enterprise lists, because I particularly find it to be incredibly frustrating. The first 30 minutes of this episode is actually pretty decent, as we sort of get a character exploration of Dr. Phlox. This is, I think, Phlox's first episode where he gets to be centered in the entirety of the show so far, and it does start to have a really interesting morality tale of we have a split society of 2 different species, and one is dying, but they subjugate the other species, and we sort of ultimately learn that the other species is actually intelligent, and maybe once the other species dies off, then this species may rise to prominence and be able to evolve and grow and thrive.
But the Mank have the potential to become the dominant species on this planet.
And that won't happen as long as the Balakians are around.
If the Mank are to flourish, they need an opportunity to survive on their own.
Well, what are you suggesting? We choose one species over the other?
All I'm saying is that we let nature make the choice.
The hell with nature.
And that's an interesting sort of concept to play with. Where this episode gets frustrating, though, is how much it tries to force in this Prime Directive justification plot at the end, where it just has like Phlox sort of going to Archer and being like, well, we can't interfere in the natural evolution of this species because that would be unethical for some reason. And I'm like, that's kind of messed up.
I appreciate your perspective on all of this. But we're talking about something that might happen. Might happen thousands of years from now. They've asked for our help. I am not prepared to walk away based on a theory.
Evolution is more than a theory. It is a fundamental scientific principle. Forgive me for saying so. But I believe your compassion for these people is affecting your judgment.
My compassion guides my judgment.
Captain,
can you find a cure?
Number one, this sort of idea of there being a natural evolution of a planet is sort of justifying God in a way, and this is the problem that I have with how the Prime Directive is sometimes depicted. I don't mind the Prime Directive as like a general idea, and so I like it as a guideline, not an absolute like one-off rule that needs to be justified, because it ultimately leads to this being like there's a natural order to the universe, and we can't interfere in any way, shape, or form, because that would just mean that we're interfering with, I guess, God's plan, because ultimately that's what this is. It's, while they're not actually saying God, by assuming there is a natural order to the universe, that is implying that there is a God. And considering Star Trek is a very secular show, I'm not, you know, as someone who is agnostic, I'm not saying like you can't have discussions of religion in Star Trek or anything like that, but like this utilization of like God justifies all, even though they're not saying God, is just very frustrating. And you can very clearly see at the end of the episode the hand of the writer existing, being like, with Archer saying like, until my people craft that directive, one might even say a prime directive of a sort.
And what I've decided goes against all my principles. Someday, my people are going to come up with some sort of a doctrine. Something that tells us what we can and can't do out here. Should and shouldn't do. But until somebody tells me that they've drafted that directive, I'm going to have to remind myself every day that we didn't come out here to play God.
Well, I just have to go with my conscience. And so you just sort of see this very forced prequel-itis where it's just like, oh, they're clearly leading to the Prime Directive, but doing it so in a way that makes both Phlox and Archer ethically dubious and ultimately, you could argue, complicit in a genocide of a people. Like, don't get me wrong, the subjugation of this other alien race is awful and we like shouldn't allow it to happen, but to like justify a genocide in order to allow that to happen is kind of fucked up. And so ultimately it really makes you dislike Phlox in one of his first episodes and Archer, and very much you feel the hand of the writer in terms of trying to force this prequel Prime Directive plot. Number 4, COGENITOR. Yet again, we have another Star Trek Enterprise episode that has to do with the Prime Directive. There's almost like there's a through line for me in terms of my issues with early Star Trek Enterprise episodes. And it's kind of sad considering how much I do actually like Star Trek Enterprise overall. But I actually have different problems with this episode than I do with Dear Doctor, because the problem with Dear Doctor is very much them trying to force this Prime Directive plot in a spot where it didn't really work and kind of ultimately justifies like a natural order to the universe. Whereas this episode, I think, does a much better job of showcasing what I like the Prime Directive to be used for, where it's like, well, we are sort of outsiders looking at another culture. How can we don't really have the right to interfere with them, and it's honestly just kind of easier and better for everybody if we just sort of back off a little bit and just not try to instigate our heads where we haven't been asked to belong. This sort of like anti-colonialist impulse and the anti like sort of judging another society impulse that the Prime Directive sort of leads to. However, my issue with how it's depicted in this episode is how much it dehumanizes one person who is asking for help, and also specifically for me personally, and this, I know this is a personal thing considering who I am, the fact that that person who is dehumanized and devalued and ultimately left to die at the end of the episode is a non-binary coded alien, hits me very hard as someone who is non-binary in the real world. Because at the end of the day, could we question whether or not Trip should have gotten involved in investigating this non-binary aliens, this COGENITOR's place within the society? Possibly. But at the point where Trip has done this, and this cogenitor has come to Archer and asked for asylum because they are essentially living in what amounts to the Handmaid's Tale. Like, if you look at the story of this world where this cogenitor is a non-binary alien who is depersoned and yet clearly is intelligent and is passed around as essentially a sex doll to help other people reproduce, this is essentially a non-binary Handmaid's Tale within the Star Trek universe, and that is absolutely freaking horrible. This person is sexually assaulted regularly just for reproductive purposes.
You don't understand. I can't go back.
Just until we resolve this.
Trip said I have the same rights as they do.
It's not our place to tell you what rights you have. I'm sorry.
Are you going to force me to leave?
So when you have that being hinted at in this episode, and this person coming to you saying, like, this is hell for me, please give me asylum. And then Archer, again, utilizing the Prime Directive, sort of proto-Prime Directive thinking to say, like, well, can't get involved, to the point where then that person goes back and dies by suicide because living in that horror was just too much. And then the episode having the gall to turn around and have Archer say to Trip, oh, this is your fault for having gotten involved. You should have never gotten involved in any way, shape, or form. I'm like,
it's time you learned to weigh the possible repercussions of your actions. You've always been impulsive. Maybe this will teach you a lesson.
I understand. Do you?
I'm not so sure you do. You knew you had no business interfering with those people, but you just couldn't let it alone. You thought you were doing the right thing. I might agree if this was Florida or Singapore, but it's not, is it?
Fuck you, Archer. Fuck you. You should have helped this person. I don't care about the moral dubiousness of whether Trip should have gotten involved. That's a gray area that we could have an interesting discussion on about whether he was right or wrong. I personally lean on the side that Trip did have some sort of moral ability to do what he did, but we could talk about it. It's definitely a gray area. But when someone comes to you and says, I'm being depersoned and sexually assaulted essentially and I require asylum, fuck you for not granting that. I'm sorry it would have been messy for you, Archer, and it's very frustrating this episode just wants to have the clean, like, oh, we can't have this continuing on next week, so we'll just try and have this nice, like, wrap up at the end of the episode. It's really messed up, and the fact that it leads to another bury your gaze storyline within Star Trek honestly just saddens me. So while I understand that this episode is much better at wrestling with some of the more complexity than Dear Doctor is, because Dear Doctor is very much trying to force that issue, whereas here it's a little bit more gray, and I at least appreciate that. The very fact that this is a non-binary person whose humanity, or personhood, I guess I should say, is completely ignored and literally dies by suicide because of it, hits me very hard, and it really frustrates me with this entire episode. Number 5, Nepenthe. So, this episode might shock a lot of people because Star Trek Picard is a fairly controversial Star Trek show right now. I mean, even amongst people who like modern Star Trek like myself. Like, I like Discovery, I love Strange New Worlds, I love Lower Decks, I love Prodigy, I love all those shows. Even amongst that, Picard sort of still, for me, has a sort of mixed quality to it. I love certain elements of that show, both in Season 1 and Season 2, but ultimately I don't feel like it works as well as it should. For me personally, and that doesn't mean that you have to agree with me. If you love Star Trek Picard or you hate Star Trek Picard, that's totally cool. But even amongst people who both like and dislike Star Trek Picard, most people will point to the episode Nepenthe as one of these show's strongest episodes in its first season. And you can understand why, because this episode gives us what I think a lot of us longtime Trekkies really wanted to see, which was we get to return and see Riker and Troy getting to be a family and them having a child, and we're getting to learn a little bit more of their history and getting to see our kind of small version of the TNG crew just getting to live a life, and it's very sweet and loving and adorable, and I love getting to see Riker making a pizza.
You get to make the decisions about who gets to take the chances and who doesn't, and who's in the loop and who's out of the loop, and naturally, it always ends up with you.
Well,
that's fine on the bridge of your starship, Captain, but now you're dealing with a teenager, more or less. That can be an extremely humbling experience. Frankly, I'm not sure you're up to it.
perhaps I'm not. There you go. Baby steps. Baby steps.
And I also love seeing Kestra, Riker, Troy being an absolutely adorable human being. And yes, there is a small tragedy of like Riker and Troy's first child having died when he was very, very young due to a disease. But even that kind of works for me in terms of some of the themes that the season was wrestling with. So ultimately, all that stuff I think is great and honestly creates one of the best episodes of Picard. However, a lot of people also forget when we talk about this episode that it is also the very same episode where we see Hugh, the wonderful character from Iborg and Descent in Star Trek The Next Generation, get killed for the weird nonsense Romulan XB Borg plot in a way that felt very forced, very unnecessary, and ultimately makes me deeply upset.
I was that much of a hopeful fool again for a minute. Thanks for that.
Because Hugh is a character that a lot of us really, really loved and invested in. And honestly, his storyline in the first season of Picard was one of the things that I really liked. I liked seeing him getting to be a leader of XBs. And so for him to get murdered by this weird Romulan character who no one really gives a crap about and ultimately is entirely forgettable, and his death feeling so ancillary to the story being told, like his death didn't feel like it needed to have happened, really feels disappointing, and it makes this episode a frustrating watch to go from some of the best stuff that the show has to offer to one of the most frustrating, forced, and unnecessary, like just trying to tug at your emotional heartstrings for no reason, bits in the entire series. And I also have to say, on top of all of that, as a queer person watching this episode, while the character of Hugh is not overtly gay, Jonathan Del Arco, who is a gay man, has spoken about how he played Hugh as a sort of a send-up and a love letter to one of his friends who died from HIV during the 1980s AIDS crisis. Makes the fact that he gets killed in this storyline even harder because it becomes essentially another bury your gays storyline, even on just a metaphorical level. So in this episode, we have Picard going off to get to have a fun pizza time with Riker and Troy and their heteronormative family structure, while the gay character, or at least the gay-coded character on the episode, gets murdered for no real justifiable reason within the story. Not only reads frustrating as a longtime Trekkie, but also kind of stings as a queer person as well. So on all those levels, while I love 70% of this episode and everything with Riker and Picard and Troy, the fact that this episode also contains the death of Hugh and all that that represents means that this episode cannot be one of my favorite episodes of Picard, even though many other people would consider it to be one of their favorites, or if not their favorite episode of the entire series. So that is my list of my 5 controversial takes on 5 episodes of Star Trek. But what are your controversial takes on Star Trek? Are there episodes that a lot of other people like that you absolutely hate? Or vice versa? Do you love Threshold? Do you love Sub Rosa? I'd love to hear all that in the comments below. Do you hate me? Are you angry at me? Do you think these takes are dumb and stupid? I'd love to hear that in the comments below as well. But beyond all of that, just thank you so much for being here. I adore you. I love you. And thank you so much for sticking with me in my hot takes. And I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper, my friends.